You're listening to Bonus Points, the official podcast of Mr. Astel's theology class. Join us as we put out into the deep and explore the world of theology and beyond. Today, we're talking about one of my favorite movies, the 1993 classic Jurassic Park. Let's begin. Before we start, I want to thank you for tuning in. This is the first real episode since episode 1 was just an introduction to the show. Our new website is live, and on that website I'll be posting show notes for each episode with links to the resources that I used for research and whatever other fun stuff I think of. You can check it out at sites.google.com/view/bonuspointspodcast. Okie dokie, let's go. Jurassic Park is one of those movies that was a major part of my childhood, and I still love to return to it over and over again. Like many kids, I love dinosaurs, and it's kind of a chicken and egg or dinosaur and egg maybe situation. Did I love Jurassic Park because I love dinosaurs, or did my dinosaur phase begin because of Jurassic Park? In any case, it's a movie that I began to appreciate more as I grew up, and I continue to get more out of it every time I watch it. In my opinion, it is one of the best movie adaptations of a book ever made. On that note, my love for the movie is what led me to read the book, which was my introduction to Michael Crichton, who would soon become my favorite fiction author. I'll admit it took me a while to understand some of the nuances of the plot. For example, I missed the entire plot with Nedry stealing the embryos until I was about 10 years old. And even then, I thought that the fences going out was just a coincidence. All right, here's an embarrassing one. There's a scene in the control room right after the tour stops to see the sick Triceratops. The scene ends with somebody, I think it was John Arnold maybe, pressing a button, and then it immediately cuts back to the tour group with this huge roll of thunder. Until recently, I'm not going to say how recently, I had assumed that pressing the button somehow caused the thunder. I have no idea where I got that from. So, okay, before we go any further, we should take a moment to give a quick synopsis of the movie for any listeners who haven't seen it or haven't seen it in a while. So here's the basic plot. InGen is a bioengineering company, and they figured out how to extract dinosaur DNA from prehistoric mosquitoes, and they've used that DNA to clone dinosaurs. They've created a combination zoo/amusement park on a private island in Costa Rica, which they hope to open to the public soon. After InGen's insurance company becomes concerned about the safety of the island, InGen's CEO, John Hammond, brings a group of experts to the island to spend the weekend. The idea is that they'll see how safe the island is and then sign a statement to reassure the lawyers. Meanwhile, a disgruntled employee of InGen named Dennis Nedry has agreed to steal dinosaur embryos and sell them to InGen's competitor. Using his position as a computer programmer, he schedules a power outage in order to disable the security cameras and the electronic door locks so that he can sneak into the embryo storage room. Unfortunately, his power outage also disables the electric fences throughout the park, which leads to the dinosaurs escaping, and the rest of the movie follows the group's attempt to make it off the island alive. Okay. When I watch this movie now, I can't help but think of some of the interesting theological questions that come up, and it's those questions that we're addressing today. We're going to start with what the church might say about the morality of beginning a project like Jurassic Park in the first place. Would cloning dinosaurs for a zoo be permissible? We'll also evaluate the morality of Dennis Nedry's actions, including stealing dinosaur embryos to sell to InGen's competitors, and shutting down the park's electricity in order to enable the theft. Just for fun, we'll see what the Dietary Laws of the Old Testament have to say and decide whether dinosaur could be on the menu in an Israelite home. We'll look at the church's modern practice of abstaining from meat on Fridays and see whether we could serve plesiosaur at a fish fry. Finally, we'll look at one of the major lessons of Jurassic Park, about man's attempt to control nature, and we'll see how that fits with the church's teaching on ecology. First, let's consider the question of whether it is morally acceptable to clone dinosaurs. Believe it or not, the church has never spoken about cloning dinosaurs, as far as I can tell. The question of cloning animals has come up, though, and it would seem to me that these two questions would have the same moral considerations. Now, the church has not spoken definitively about the morality of cloning animals. in part because it's still a relatively new technology. It's only maybe 30 years old, and it hasn't been too controversial. The church has spoken in much clearer terms about human cloning, and it's a hard no, but the reasoning behind that is mostly based on the fact that we're made in the image of God, so that same logic wouldn't necessarily apply to cloning animals. That particular subject has come up a lot less frequently. Before we continue, we need to dispel a common misconception about the way the church teaches. Many people believe that church teaching is one big monolithic group and everything that's part of this group is of the same level of importance and authority. That is not the case. The magisterium, the teaching office of the church, actually takes many different forms. Sometimes the magisterium teaches in a solemn way, for example, at an ecumenical council like the Council of Nicaea. We believe that these teachings are protected from error by the Holy Spirit, and so we call them infallible. We also have, though, what's called the ordinary magisterium, which is not necessarily infallible. It still merits what we call religious assent, which basically means that we should give it the benefit of the doubt, but it's possible that, for example, an individual bishop might teach something that is false. By the way, if all of this sounds familiar to you, sophomores and juniors, it's because this is going to be coming up in class shortly, as of when I'm recording here in late January. When we look at the issue of cloning animals specifically, we see that the solemn infallible magisterium has never addressed it. So you can find some legitimate differences in thought between scholars, where some say, for example, that it's always immoral, others say it might be permissible under certain circumstances. That said, scholars, theologians, aren't part of the magisterium. Bishops are, as well as the different groups that make up the Roman Curia, which is the government of the church. So for our purposes, we're going to limit ourselves to only what the magisterium has said on the issue, meaning bishops and different groups within the Curia. Now, I could only find one place where the question of cloning animals is addressed specifically, so we'll be looking at a 1997 document that was promulgated by the Pontifical Academy for Life called Reflections on Cloning. We're only going to be looking at a brief excerpt, but I'll have a link to the full document in the show notes. As you would expect, the document talks mostly about why it is immoral to clone humans. However, we do find this in the fourth and final section. It says, "Moreover, there is a place for research, including cloning, in the vegetable and animal kingdoms, wherever it answers a need or provides a significant benefit for man or for other living beings, provided that the rules for protecting the animal itself and the obligation to respect the biodiversity of species are observed. When scientific research in man's interest aims to cure diseases, to relieve suffering, to solve problems due to malnutrition, to make better use of the Earth's resources, it represents a hope for humanity, entrusted to the talent and efforts of scientists." So basically, animal cloning is permissible under two conditions. First, the intent of the scientists must be to answer a need or provide a significant benefit for man or other animals. Second, the process must not cause unnecessary suffering for any animals involved, and it shouldn't mess too much with nature's biodiversity. Let's start with that second one. Introducing dinosaurs into the ecosystem would definitely disrupt biodiversity. After all, many of these dinosaurs, at least the ones that InGen created, are massive hunters with no living predators. This would be the ultimate invasive species. Now, to their credit, InGen did not intend for the dinosaurs to get into the ecosystem and even took steps to prevent them from flourishing or breeding in the wild. However, these measures, like the fences, failed. Even before the events of the movie, the dinosaurs were breeding and getting off the island. Dozens of small Compsognathus, or compies, bred and escaped without notice in the first scene of the book, which then became the opening scene of the second movie. What about InGen's intent for creating the dinosaurs? Was it to answer a need or provide some benefit to humanity? Here I think the evidence points to no. John Hammond talks a lot about how the park is supposed to bring happiness and wonder to children, which could be considered a benefit to humanity if you stretch a little. But in his more candid moments, we get the impression that the true motive for creating Jurassic Park is making money. In my opinion, creating a theme park for rich kids does not meet the requirements laid out here by the Pontifical Academy for Life. When the Pontifical Academy talks about benefit to humanity here, that's mostly referring to knowledge that would benefit mankind. Now, the quantity of knowledge that you could gain about a dinosaur by studying a living specimen is astronomical compared to what we can learn through just looking at fossils. So from that perspective, it would seem that cloning dinosaurs would greatly benefit humanity. Even if their primary motive is making money, they're still providing a paradigm-shifting resource for those who study dinosaurs, right? Unfortunately, it's unclear how much you could actually learn about dinosaurs by studying the clones that InGen was producing. The DNA that InGen recovered from the preserved mosquitoes was incomplete, so their geneticists filled in the gaps with DNA of other animals, especially frogs. This means that for as much as they look like dinosaurs, or at least what we assume dinosaurs would look like, it's impossible to know just how similar they are to the real deal. There's a tense conversation to this effect in the book between Hammond and chief geneticist Henry Wu. Wu's trying to convince Hammond to greenlight some tweaks in the DNA to make the dinosaurs look and act more like what people expect. And part of that conversation is explaining how the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park are by no means accurate. So, while I think you could have a good conversation about the morality of creating Jurassic Park, in my opinion, the evidence leans more toward the negative. What about Nedry's actions in stealing the embryos? Thankfully, this one is a lot more straightforward, and that is not good news for Mr. Nedry. The seventh commandment forbids stealing, and Nedry's entire mission is to steal embryos which belong to InGen and sell them to a competitor. This would also be a form of corporate espionage, which violates our obligation to protect confidential information that we come across in the course of our professional duties. As paragraph 2491 of the Catechism says, professional secrets or confidential information given under the seal of secrecy must be kept, save in exceptional cases where keeping the secret is bound to cause very grave harm to the one who confided it, to the one who received it, or to a third party, and where the very grave harm can be avoided only by divulging the truth. I'll have a link to that section of the Catechism in the show notes as well. Now, in order to steal the embryos, Nedry shuts down power to the park. Mainly, he does this to disable the electronic door locks and the security cameras, though he also disables the phones and electric fences in the process. In order to evaluate the morality of this action, there are 3 things we need to look at. Juniors, this should sound familiar from the fall. We need to consider the object, which is the action taken, the end, or intention, and any other relevant circumstances, such as the actual outcome or what consequences follow. All 3 of these pieces have to check out in order for the action to be morally good. It's not enough to have just 1 or 2. The object, in this case, is shutting off the electricity to the park. This action is morally neutral. After all, there are plenty of legitimate reasons to turn off the power. His intent is a problem here. He turns off the power specifically to enable a sin against the 7th commandment, which, by the way, that would even constitute grave matter, or a serious sin. Not only that, there are some pretty serious negative outcomes that result from this action. Because he shuts down power to the fences, the dinosaurs escape. Now, this leads to serious injuries among the other people in the park, and even causes several deaths. While Nedry didn't intend for the dinosaurs to escape, and it's unclear whether he even intended to disable the fences in the first place, his actions were still responsible for all of the damage that followed. So we can safely say that Dennis Nedry's actions were not morally acceptable. After the break, we'll look at whether dinosaurs on the menu and how the movie's major theme fits with the church's teaching on the environment. We'll be back in just a minute. This episode is brought to you by me, my mic, and a Wi-Fi connection. But this is where an ad read would go if I had any sponsors. For now, I'll just give a shout out to the students who encouraged me to make the podcast and the ones who tuned in to episode 1. I'm thankful for your support and especially for the positive feedback that I've received. Welcome back. Before the break, we considered some of the moral questions raised by Jurassic Park. Now, two less important, but just as interesting questions. Assuming the dinosaurs were brought back from extinction, would the dietary laws of the Pentateuch permit you to eat them? What about the church's practice of abstaining from meat on Fridays? Would dinosaurs count as meat? What about aquatic animals from the Mesozoic era, like plesiosaurs? First, let's talk about the dietary laws of the Old Testament. The 5 books of Moses, also called the Pentateuch in Greek or the Torah in Hebrew, provide 613 mitzvot, or laws. Some of them are familiar moral commands, like the 10 Commandments. Others address minute details of daily life, like how to dress and what to eat. Sometimes Christians are criticized because we insist that some of these laws are still binding on us, but that we're not required to follow others, for example, the dietary laws. Now, I know this topic comes up in multiple classes, including Old Testament and Christian morality, so many of you will probably find this familiar. When we look at the mitzvot, we see that they're divided into roughly 3 categories. Some laws are moral laws, which tell us what is right and wrong. This includes the 10 Commandments, the prohibitions against incest, bestiality, for example. Other laws are civil laws that govern the people of Israel. The dietary laws would be in this category. They establish what life looks like as a citizen of Israel, but they don't claim to be moral issues. Finally, many of the laws apply to the worship of the Levitical priests in the tabernacle, which would later become the temple. Now, because the Levitical priesthood, along with the temple, ceased to exist after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, these laws no longer apply. The kingdom of Israel, too, no longer exists as such, so those civil laws do not have any jurisdiction anymore. That leaves the moral laws, which we do follow, not because they're part of the Old Covenant per se, but because they're also reflected in the natural law, which binds all people of all times. Anyway, what would those dietary laws say about dinosaurs? Well, it's unclear, but it doesn't look good. The Torah defines clean, land-dwelling animals as those which have cloven hoofs and which chew their cud. While we don't know much about the dietary habits of dinosaurs, or even whether they're more similar to reptiles or birds, we do know enough to exclude many popular dinosaurs. For example, chewing cud is a behavior only of herbivores, so that eliminates carnivores and omnivores. Beyond that, we don't know much. After all, it's hard to learn about the internal anatomy of an animal when you only ever see its skeleton. That said, we have been able to study the fossilized remains of a mummified hadrosaur. This hadrosaur, which is a large duck-billed dinosaur, died, and its body was mummified, and then that mummy fossilized. This is important because that means the fossil includes not only bone, but also fossilized tissue. Normally, all the tissues have decomposed long before the fossilization process begins. Anyway, this hadrosaur seems to have had a crop or a gizzard similar to the ones found in modern birds and reptiles. Both crops and gizzards are pouches used to store food internally, which is not dissimilar to the multi-chambered stomachs that ruminants, animals that chew cud, have. So while it's hard to say anything with certainty, it is definitely possible that hadrosaurs, at least, have passed the first test. It's possible that they chewed their cud. But remember, the Torah requires the animal to both chew cud and have cloven or separated hoofs. Did the hadrosaur have hoofs at all? Most fossil specimens wouldn't be able to tell us because hooves are mostly made up of keratin, the same material as your nails and hair. Typically, this doesn't survive the fossilization process, but we have a dino mummy, remember. And it looks like the mummified hadrosaur fossil does in fact have hooves. They are not, however, split. So unfortunately, that would take hadrosaur off the menu. What about aquatic animals from the Mesozoic era? Now, technically, they're not dinosaurs, but colloquially, we call them dinosaurs. Now, when it comes to aquatic animals, the Torah stipulates that it must have both fins and scales. The most famous aquatic dinosaur is the plesiosaur, which looks similar to how you might picture the Loch Ness Monster. It definitely had fins, but did it have scales? Again, we don't really know. We can get some information about plesiosaur skin by studying the impressions made on the bones, but there's no conclusive evidence. Based on my research, and by that I mean based on reading the research of actual paleontologists, it would seem that most of the fossils that have been evaluated lean toward the plesiosaur having smooth skin. Think of like a shark or a dolphin. If this is the case, then plesiosaur is also off the menu. Finally, what about the large aquatic dinosaur from Jurassic World? That was a mosasaur, and paleontologists believe that it did have scales and fins. So, while most dinosaurs and other animals from the Mesozoic era are certainly not kosher, we can say with some confidence that you may have been able to eat mosasaur under the law of Moses. To extend the question, what about on Fridays for Catholics? For centuries, we have practiced abstinence from meat on Fridays throughout the year, especially during Lent. Could you have some hadrosaur with your haddock? What about Camarasaurus with your cod, Pachycephalosaurus with your pike? All right, I'm done now. Here's what canon law says about abstinence from meat. It says, abstinence from meat or from some other food as determined by the Episcopal Conference is to be observed on all Fridays unless a solemnity should fall on a Friday. Well, that's less than specific. The word there for meat in the original Latin of Canon 1251 is carnis, which translates to meat. That doesn't really tell us any more specifically either. So what counts as meat? Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. So I'm going to look first at the Summa Theologiae by Thomas Aquinas, because in it, Aquinas gives a much more specific description of what counts as meat. By the way, I got a really nice 8-volume leather-bound edition of the Summa from Emmaus Road a few months ago. I'm always excited to have an excuse to break it out. So this comes from the Secunda Secundae, or the second part of the second part, when Aquinas deals with different virtues and vices. Now, in this, Aquinas defines meat as the flesh of animals that take their rest on the earth, which would include the normal land-dwelling animals you'd expect, and also birds, because they rest in trees, which are part of the earth. And this is a pretty good general rule for how we've practiced abstinence. Land-dwelling animals are off the table, but fish are allowed. Well, why is that? One reason, there are multiple things we could say here, but one reason is for most of the church's history, fish was relatively cheap and common as far as protein goes. Meat, on the other hand, like the meat of land-dwelling animals, that was a rare luxury. And that's really what penance is all about, denying ourselves luxuries. So, based on that definition from Aquinas, it would seem that dinosaurs, properly speaking, would be off the table since they're land-dwelling. Plesiosaurs and mosasaurs and other aquatic creatures from the era would be permitted. But it's not that simple, and you knew it wouldn't be. It's important to note that our abstinence from meat is a practice, not a doctrine. Our beliefs don't change over time, but our practices can. We see evidence of that in the very same article of the Summa that we quoted above. Aquinas goes on to say that in his day, animal products like milk and eggs were generally allowed on days when abstaining from meat was required, except during Lent. He said that because Lent was a more solemn fast, even animal products were not consumed. As we saw a moment ago, current canon law just says meat. So what are we to do? Well, canon law gives us the answer to that as well. In that same canon 1251, we read that Episcopal conferences, meaning conferences of bishops like the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, have the authority to make more specific laws about penance in their jurisdiction. So that means for Catholics in the U.S. today, we have to look there for the current definition of meat. The actual law is found in the Pastoral Statement on Penance and Abstinence from 1966, which, of course, is linked in the show notes. Now, since then, individual bishops have responded to specific questions, for example, whether alligator is allowed. It is. And the USCCB has then ratified their decisions. Relevant for us, we find that cold-blooded animals do not count as flesh meat and are permitted on Fridays. I suspect that rule was made after the ruling on alligator more specifically. Now, this could be a loophole for land-based dinosaurs, and it depends obviously on whether dinosaurs were cold-blooded or not, and that happens to be one of the most controversial questions in modern paleontology. For years, the standard view was that dinosaurs were cold-blooded like lizards. But some more recent studies have found many similarities with birds, including potentially being warm-blooded. We can't know for sure yet, but one important piece of evidence has to do with dinosaurs' posture. It seems that many dinosaurs stood upright. This behavior is more in line with warm-blooded creatures, since cold-blooded creatures tend to stay low to the ground for heat. Think of geckos or other lizards, the way they kind of hug the earth. Of course, as we said, the practice of abstaining from meat has evolved over the centuries, and canon law explicitly gives bishops' conferences the authority to make particular laws for the Friday penance. It's likely that if actual cloned dinosaur meat started showing up on the shelves at Wegmans, the bishops would address it specifically. But for now, we can speculate. Our short answer on whether you can eat dinosaurs on Friday is probably not. Aquatic creatures like plesiosaurs are fine, but land-dwelling dinosaurs would be off the table unless they turned out to be cold-blooded or the Bishops' Conference said otherwise. Last but not least, it's worth looking at the intersection between the major theme of Jurassic Park, man's control of nature, and the church's social teaching on the environment. In my opinion, the main lesson of Jurassic Park is that man can never truly hope to control nature, despite our best attempt. To quote Ian Malcolm, life finds a way. Jurassic Park represents a prideful attempt to control what cannot and should not be controlled, and so we should not be surprised when nature breaks free. We actually find similar language in the Church's teaching on ecology, especially in Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. In Genesis, we see that God gives man dominion over creation. This dominion can sometimes be misunderstood as a controlling domination. And this attitude is what Pope Francis speaks against. For example, in paragraph 67, he says, "We must forcefully reject the notion that our being created in God's image and given dominion over the earth justifies absolute domination over other creatures." In paragraph 68, he says, "This responsibility for God's earth means that human beings, endowed with intelligence, must respect the laws of nature and the delicate equilibria existing between the creatures of this world." It seems to me, and I think Pope Francis would agree, creating a zoo full of resurrected dinosaur clones most certainly disrespects both the laws of nature and the delicate equilibria existing between creatures. That's going to do it for today and our first real episode of Bonus Points. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe so that you don't miss an episode. If you think somebody else would enjoy it, pass it along. Be sure to check out the new website. Again, that's sites.google.com/view/bonuspointspodcast. The link is also in the description. There you'll find show notes and more information about today's topic. Until then, may God continue to bless you, your family, your friends. I'm Mr. Astle. God bless.